Hello and welcome to Speaking Spirit, where we talk about all things spiritual. Your host, John Moore, is a shamanic practitioner and spiritual teacher. And now, here's John.
Hello, everybody. I wish you a good morning, or whatever time of day it is when you listen to this. It is morning where I am. It is, as I am talking to you, we're in the beginning of October, which is a month that I enjoy a lot. Where I live in the northeastern part of the United States, this is, we entered fall in autumn or fall in September, but really this is when the leaves change colors. It's amazingly beautiful here. And the leaves fall off the trees, and the trees are bare until spring, eventually. Usually not till later in October. But the end of October is Halloween, otherwise known as Samhain. We get into All Souls Eve, Day of the Dead, all those kinds of things. Some people know this as Season of the Witch. It's a transition time, right? As all seasons are. But here it is especially true. We experience significant changes in the environment, changes in the temperature. It's not unheard of to have snow here, but before the end of the month, depending on where you live, that might be shocking. But I remember a few years back when my children were small, and if you're not in the U.S., you might not practice this, but you probably are aware that we do something called trick-or-treating with children, which is on Halloween night. Kids dress up and go from house to house, and people give them candy. And gosh, that is a favorite holiday of so many kids, as you might imagine, getting a bag full of candy once a year from strangers. I know it might sound weird if you're not used to that tradition, but it certainly was I think one of my favorite holidays growing up as a child, and certainly was for my kids. But I remember going out one year, and there was snow on the ground, and the kids had to wear boots and coats over their costumes, which is kind of a bummer. You want people to see your costumes, but the dressing up part is really cool. And of course, this goes back a long time to Celtic traditions having to do with Samhain and lighting jack-o'-lanterns to scare off evil spirits, and dressing up as ghosts and goblins, and going from house to house. And there were other traditions, including a meal to honor your ancestors, to honor the dead, because it was thought, and I believe this to be true, that this is a time where the veil between the worlds is thinner. The ancestors and spirits are able to come back and visit more readily, make their presence known, and you're able to interact with them more easily. And I think this is something I have experienced, and it's something that exists in many cultures. The Mexican Day of the Dead tradition is in my opinion a beautiful one, and recognizes this as well. If you have not seen the Disney movie Coco, it's one of my favorites. It's a Pixar animated movie that is about the Mexican Day of the Dead, and it is whatever you're feeling about mass media it is a beautiful film, full of heart and full of love and respect for ancestors, and it's funny and it's entertaining, and anyway, it's a good thing. So today's topic, I'm going to talk about death today, because we're entering that season, and I'm going to talk about death and the dead and what happens and the cyclical nature of things. Changes in seasons remind us of the cycles of, the cycles of nature, and we're a part of that. So many times people think us human beings, we consider ourselves separate from nature. And that is not reality. We are a part of nature. Yes, we have removed ourselves in many ways. Most of us live inside buildings and work and drive cars and use plastic things and participate in things that are not what someone might consider natural. But we are organic. Our bodies are organic. Excuse me. Again, if you've never listened to this, I don't really edit this. So if I have a little cough or clear my throat or whatever, I don't edit it out. I don't want people to think that I'm not a human being and make errors in my podcast or what have you. So excuse me if that comes up. I also like this to have a flow and don't interrupt my train of thought as I'm talking about stuff. So we're a part of nature and we experience cycles, and this can be seen in a lot of ways. A lot of people, when the weather gets colder, tend to nest, hibernate, rest more. We eat differently. Not always. I mean, nowadays, with the way we import food and that sort of thing, we can eat a lot of off-season food. But I, for one, am a fan of eating seasonally as much as I can. That being said, I will enjoy a banana or an orange, which are not native here. A few things that are shipped in. But this time of year where I live, it's apple harvesting season and it's pumpkin harvesting season. And there are a lot of root vegetables around. So I love that stuff this time of year. Stews and things that warm me up, and it helps my body anyway be more in tune with the cycles that we're going through. So as parts of nature, we are affected by the cycles of nature, the cycles of life. Obviously, we are born into a body. We go through childhood, adolescence, puberty. We, become adults. We hopefully live into old age and become elders. And, eventually our bodies die. And I'm going to say it that way. Our bodies die, because I do believe in an afterlife. I have witnessed enough in my career as a shamanic practitioner. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the shamanic view, or a shamanic view. I can't speak for every shamanic practitioner in the world, but I will speak from my perspective, having practiced shamanism for many years now, what the experience of death is like from that perspective. My hope is that I can demystify it a lot, because a lot of people are afraid of death. At least in the Western world here, we're so, in the U.S. especially, we're so removed from death and the dying process. There's a whole funeral industry here where, when somebody dies, the body is quickly removed and taken and cleaned up, and then you might see it for a visitation, and then it's quickly buried. And that's it. And you go through the grieving process. And it costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And I think having witnessed some other cultural traditions around what happens when people die, I feel like that's a little disconnected, and we're a little disconnected from death. And it makes us more fearful of death, because there's this unknown part of death. We don't know what's going to happen. The other aspect is, if you've grown up in Christian society, you, whether or not you practice Christianity, you most likely have some sort of reservation or fear of hellfire, right? Eternal torture. I'm going to say right off the bat that, and I don't normally like to conflict with people's belief systems. You are welcome to believe as you wish, and I will respect that. However, I will say that this concept of hell is, and pardon my French, is bullshit, and it was invented to control people, and I understand why, historically, when when religion and the government was the same thing, and we didn't really have police forces and ways to control people's behavior in society, we had to make people afraid of what would happen to them in the afterlife, because there wasn't necessarily punishment for crimes or, what was considered blasphemy or, any other offenses. And that's very plain if you read that in any of the Abrahamic religions, right? There are lots of things, for example, lots of dietary prescriptions, right? They wanted to keep people from getting sick. Don't eat pork and shellfish because there was no refrigeration or testing of, testing of food or anything like that. So those things could make people really ill. And, there were a lot of things, that didn't necessarily, that made a lot of sense, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And, what have you. And again, if you're a person who keeps kosher or halal or, what have you, totally fine. That I'm not arguing against that. It's part of your faith, and I don't hold that against anybody or say that's wrong or anything like that. I'm just saying the concept of hell was meant to keep people in line. And in my experience with death, and I'll describe what that's like in a bit, that just isn't a thing. Except for there is a little bit of an exception to that. And I'll talk about that as well. And so of course the Christian, concept of hell is that it's down below. It's the underworld. It's even the word hell, right? So what happened was, when Christianity came into areas that were predominantly pagan, they turned pagan gods, they turned pagan beliefs. As I said this, a giant hawk just flew through my yard. Very interesting. They turned pagan beliefs in the afterlife, in the underworld, into things that were demonic, of the devil. If you think about the devil as being horned and having cloven hooves, and you think about the god Pan, from Greek paganism, they are identical. They took these gods and turned them into demons, or they turned them into saints, or, whatever. They co-opted them. They co-opted holidays. They put they made Christmas in end of December to eclipse Saturnalia and other pagan holidays around the winter solstice, when most likely that wasn't close to the date. If you, believe the story of the birth of Jesus, it was probably in the springtime, sometime, because of the way it's described of the shepherds out in the field, sleeping out in the fields with their flocks. Anyway, I'm not a biblical scholar, but it is what it is. And, the word hell comes from comes from Norse belief, actually. And, hell was the underworld where most people go when they die. If you weren't killed in battle and went to Valhalla, or, you didn't go with Freya to her hall. I don't remember the name of that at this point, but if you didn't go to one of those places because you didn't die in battle, you went to hell. And hell was not eternal torture. It was sort of considered this place that was like fall. It was like eternal autumn. It was not eternal torture, that kind of thing. And of course the Greeks believed in an underworld, right? And the Romans and all of these pagan, and they believed that's where you went when you died. And in shamanism, we go to the lower world and we go to the upper world, and they aren't really heaven or hell. So as far as the concepts around this, and culturally, this is totally reinforced. We have even the TV show that I enjoy, Lucifer, about the devil. And I'll do a podcast about the devil at some point, and the changing ideas about who the devil is and what the devil is and demons and all of that sort of thing. Even the word demon, right? Even the word demon comes from the Greek, and it just means spirit. And in Greek, there were helpful spirits and harmful spirits and spirits of the house, and they were all demons. But when Christianity came in and took over, demons became denizens of hell and, the doers of the work of Satan. So, gosh, you can't have these household spirits anymore. That's devil worship. Everything became devil worship. So, I don't like to quibble too much over personal beliefs. And again, I try my best to respect everybody's personal beliefs, but this is what happened. You can't, there is no denying that this is what happened. This is historically true. So anyway, the concept of hell meant to control people, not really a thing. So, as you probably know, I'm a shamanic practitioner. I practice shamanism. I do not say the phrase, I am a shaman. That is not, in my tradition, one does not call oneself a shaman. So I use the term shamanic practitioner because it describes what I do. I practice shamanism. And I do so for myself and for clients. It is healing work that I do and other types of work that I do for clients, but it is also my spiritual path. And in shamanism, there is the concept of psychopomp, right? Psychopomp is, again, it's a Greek term, and it means basically a spirit guide, a guide of spirits, and it holds the connotation of a person or a spirit, a person who guides spirits after death, right? It's not just like a spirit guide, like you talk to a spirit and they give you guidance. This is specifically like, the pomp part of psychopomp is where we get like pomp and circumstance. It's like, I believe it means like tour. Someone who gives, like a tour guide, right? And psycho, where we get the words psychology and psychiatry and all of those things meaning mind, actually is a Greek word for spirit. It's a Greek word for spirit, right? There's more than one, and I will get into that a little bit too, because there are, you might think of your spirit as one thing. But it can be divided up into numerous things. You can think of a human being as a whole system of systems, which includes mind, body, and many spiritual components. But we are made up of very complicated parts, right? Think about our nervous system and our circulatory system just on the body level. And if you think about the mind level, you have your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, and you have habits and beliefs and values, all of these things living sort of in the mental plane, and the spiritual plane is no less complex. And there are many types. There's etheric and astral and noetic and causal and all of this stuff. And they're ultimately just labels for things, for phenomena that are parts of the human experience. So anyway, back to I am Mr. Digression. If you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, you'll learn that I like to go off on tangents, but it's all relevant, I promise. So the concept of the psychopomp is somebody who helps people after they die, and in shamanism, you might actually help people through the death and dying process. There are people out there today who are considered like death doulas who help people sort of physically and mentally through the dying process. And people who practice shamanism, it's part of their job and has been so for a long, long time. So I have done, it's not my primary thing, but I have done a fair amount of psychopomp work. I have worked with people who have died recently. I have worked with spirits who died many years ago but were stuck. You might call them ghosts, or spirits that you encounter on the sort of the plane that we exist on, which shamans consider the middle world, right? It's where we get Midgard or Middle Earth from. Midgard being the Norse realm for where we live, and Middle Earth being the J.R.R. Tolkien version in the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings series. Right. So, and the same concept. It's the spiritual overlay of the world that we live in. Again, there are all these layers to us and all these layers to the world that we live in and the beings that we encounter here. So sometimes spirits get stuck. We might call them ghosts in, shamanic thinking, or at least in my tradition. We do not exorcise ghosts, like kick them out, bottle them up, trap them, do things to them, because they're suffering beings. They don't have a body anymore, so they're not suffering from pain, but they're spiritually suffering if they're stuck. Even if they don't know that they're stuck, they're suffering from the perspective that their existence could be much more pleasant if they went to where they were supposed to go. So, what happens after we die is that a conscious part of us, our soul body, separates from our etheric body and from other parts of us, and this is the part that is sort of you may consider it an astral body. If you want to get really technical, I'm not going to go too far down the metaphysical bodies path, because that could be, there are many volumes of many books written about all of that stuff, and I could only very briefly touch on that topic. But it is, it's that would be a very huge tangent. And I'm also not the expert on that either. But I do know that, parts of you separate from your physical body. The body dies. The etheric body separates. The astral body separates from the body. There is a deeper connection. There's a deeper connection to divinity that exists, that is sort of the true self, that is the spark of divine light that's within us, that is unborn, undying, incorruptible. That part goes on as it is, and because that part is so formless, we can sort of visualize it as a spot of bright light, but it really is formless. It sort of exists outside of time and space, and so while we might think of it as being inside the body, for for the easy sake of getting in touch with it and visualizing it and that sort of thing. It doesn't really exist inside the body, so it doesn't need to separate from the body at the point of death. So sometimes what happens if somebody's going through the dying process, let's say somebody is sick and they're in a hospital and maybe they're coming in and out of consciousness, or they're in a coma, or that sort of thing. Very frequently, loved ones will experience visitations. Will see that loved one who is in the hospital and not quite dead yet, or that person will reach out or what have you. And what's going on there is that the astral body really is starting to separate. The person is in the dying process. The astral body is trying to separate, or starting, not trying, it's starting to separate. It's happening slowly. It's sort of happening at the pace at which the body is shutting down. And this is not, it's not painful. It's not, anything. It's just, it is what it is. It's what, it's part of the dying process. So when people have near-death experiences and come back, they frequently report being outside of their bodies. Sometimes, if somebody dies on an operating table, they can, look down and see surgeons working on them and hear the conversations that are going on, even though the body is under heavy anesthesia and maybe even technically dead. So the at the time of death, or even as a person is dying, the astral body really loses touch with the body, because the astral body is going to survive and go on to where it's supposed to go. So this happens, and these visitations happen, and they very frequently happen right after death, even if death is sudden, or for a period of time. Lots of people have come to me that they're seeing loved ones who just recently died, passing on information either in dreams, or they're seeing them, or they're smelling something that reminds them of the person, or whatever. These are not always just tricks of the mind, of the grieving mind. Sometimes these are actual visitations. Very frequently they happen in dreams, because we're much more open in our dreams, and this is when these spirits can contact us. So in my experience, very often, in fact, most of the time when people die, what you might call the spirit, the astral body, sticks around for a number of days, checking in on loved ones and going about perhaps some unfinished business. But primarily I see this happening with people checking in on loved ones. And then most of the time they cross over to some kind of afterlife, and that's not hell. Because I have worked with people who were murderers, people who were in the Italian mafia, who had murdered people, and were relatives of the person I had as a client, and I helped them cross over, and they did not wind up going to hell. So, like I said, in my experience, in my firsthand experience, that isn't a thing. So the astral part of us, this which is really, really conscious part of us, crosses over to another side. And again, there are multiple parts that make up our spiritual body, and they kind of go in different directions. And this was recognized by many, many cultures over time. The multiple parts of the body, right? The spirit, and the energy body, the soul body, all of these things. And so again, I'm not going to go down the metaphysics path about what happens to all of these different parts. You can look at the ancient Egyptian beliefs, for example, that this part went here and this part did this and this part did this. So yeah, there's a separation that happens. There's a separation of astral and physical and mental and all of these things. But your astral holds memories of what you went through in life. It can hold on to wounding, all kinds of stuff. And so you go to an afterlife. So here's the part about the afterlife. So what the afterlife is like depends significantly on your personal and cultural beliefs. So if you think that heaven is, or the afterlife or whatever is up, you tend to go up, and you'll see clouds, and you'll see loved ones, and you'll see this, and you'll see that. You'll experience all kinds of things. Because the reality is that spirit and these realms, they're non-physical. So they don't have time, space, and form other than what we give to them. And so we can experience them as anything. So there's work that's done if you ever go through an apprenticeship in shamanism, and you do death and dying work, where you actually cross over, and you have to do that. You have to see what it's like. You have to experience it. And I can tell you, having been there numerous times, and having taught people how to go there, and having led people there, that it is warm and welcoming and inviting and beautiful, and there is no pain, and there's no suffering, and there's no anxiety, and there's no stress. There is joy, and there is peace, and there is what you would want to experience there. So I'm going to give you an example, and I will, because I don't talk about, I hold client work very confidential. I'm going to anonymize the way I describe this, and, give some details will be a little bit vague. So, I was working with somebody who asked me to go check in on a beloved aunt who had passed away a number of years ago. And I didn't have any details other than this person's name and I believe, the year and the location of their death. And so I journeyed. Shamanic journey is like, it's like a very visual meditation where, a shamanic practitioner actually splits off part of their consciousness, and it can travel to other realms. And so, I traveled to this person's aunt, and I don't take for granted that I'm seeing objective truth, right? Like I'm seeing something on a spiritual plane, and my mind is making some sense out of it by, painting pictures and letting me have a conversation with somebody. So when I got there, there was this woman, an older woman who I could physically describe, and she was standing on a cliff overlooking the sea, and there was a sunset, and she was painting a beautiful picture of the sunset. And I had a conversation with her briefly, and she said, the afterlife is really amazing. I've always wanted to paint sunsets, but they always happen too fast. But here I can, just think I want to paint a sunset, and the sunset lasts as long as I need it to, and I can paint a picture. So she's really into painting sunsets, and she could keep a sunset going for, her experience of hours. Time works really differently there, but what we would experience as hours, she could keep the sunset sort of still and paint and have a beautiful experience. And she relayed to me that she was, visiting another relative frequently, and that they were playing card games together in this other relative's kitchen and all of these things. So I came back from the journey, and I relayed this information to the client and said, your aunt's very happy. She's painting pictures, and she said to me, "Oh yeah, my aunt was a painter," which was not something I knew before I went. And I said, "Well, she's visiting her sister, and they're playing cards in her kitchen." And she said, "Yes, that's my grandmother who passed before she did. And before that happened, they used to play cards in her kitchen all the time. And that was one of their favorite activities." So, in the afterlife, you can visit loved ones who have passed. And loved ones do make trips back. They do visit us. They do have visitations. That I get consulted about that very frequently to look in on us. So that happens as well. So let me talk about reincarnation a little bit. So reincarnation is something I absolutely 100% believe in. I have experienced what are called past life returns, which is information coming back to me from past lives that I had no way of knowing otherwise. And this is common. You'll see it in sort of Tibetan Buddhism, where they pick new lamas, like the Dalai Lama or whatever. And, when they have candidates and they're trying to figure out who this next incarnation is, they will, present certain tests to these candidates, and the candidates will be able to pick out belongings from the person who they're reincarnating from. So how, if we go into the afterlife and we hang out there and we do what we're doing and what have you, how on earth do we reincarnate? Like, how could there be anybody in the afterlife if we reincarnate? So the answer to that is relatively complex, and too complex to, again, get into the metaphysical details. But I will say this, that my understanding and my experience is that it is a part of you that reincarnates. It's a part of your soul body and a part of your etheric makeup and a part of you that comes into a new body. So you are basically a spiritual ancestor to your next incarnation. It is sort of like my children. I pass my DNA, or they get half of their DNA from me. I pass that on to them, but I also don't cease to exist. And that's probably the best way I can describe it. Your entire consciousness does not reincarnate. Because if it did, you would be born remembering everything. And that doesn't exactly happen, but you can get in touch with memories, and you can have experiences because you are connected. You're connected on this this sort of chain that goes back to the beginning of time. So you are your own ancestor and your own descendant and all of those things. And in the future I'll do a whole podcast about reincarnation. And I know there are different beliefs from different places about reincarnation, and some people don't believe in it at all. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what happens with people who don't believe in reincarnation at all, if they reincarnate. My feeling is they do, because, for a number, I believe that for a number of reasons. One, because there are still lessons to learn, which is kind of the reason we reincarnate into bodies. Like, you can think of, physical birth as like we're starting school over again. We've got a bunch of stuff we've got to learn here. We've got to experience, and the way to do that is through incarnating into a physical body And yes, that includes trauma and pain and all kinds of things that we think of as not so nice, not so pleasant, not wonderful. And that makes things kind of complicated when we see, if you view God and the universe in really black and white terms, good and evil. Everything that happens to us that's good comes from God, and everything that happens to us that's bad comes from the devil. That having that sort of black and white binary vision of reality is not particularly helpful. It's not, and it really, really leads a lot of people astray. Because the universes, and reality are much more complicated than that. Much, much, much more complicated than that. So to give like a sort of silly example, right? Let's say a bear kills me and eats me. I'm walking through the woods and a bear eats me for dinner. Well, that would be a terrible thing from my perspective, right? But would we say that bear is evil? Is that an evil bear? Is that bear just malicious and evil? Does that bear have evil intent? Does it pre-plan killing me for revenge, or because it hates the color of my skin, or what have you? Anything that we attribute to people being evil or what have you. And I think most people would say no, a bear's just doing what a bear does. Right? So, while that would be tragic for the people who loved me, bears do kill other animals and sometimes people, and for food, and so do tigers, and so do, other animals. And as parts of, as human animals, we are not always at the top of the food chain. We have technology that helps us do that, but not always. And so, the world is much more the world as we experience it is much more complicated than just dividing everything into good and evil. Good things are good and bad things are evil, and there's no in between. And so that, that the things that happen to us can be tragic, they can be traumatic, they can be painful. Can sometimes feel like the universe is punishing us. All of that. And I understand that, and I get that. And dying can seem very tragic. And certainly the people who grieve for you can experience your death as traumatic or what have you. But again, that's putting sort of human middle world values on things. It's just it's a perspective, right? I'm not saying grief is a perspective. Grief is a natural process that human beings go through, and it's important. It's an important process. It's not comfortable. Grieving's not comfortable. It's not happy. It's not how joyous I am that I grieve a loss. But it appears to be very important to our minds and spirits to grieve loss, to go through that process. And because problems occur when the grief process is interrupted or stunted or repressed, right? And people grieve for a lot of different reasons, right? They can grieve. We don't just grieve other people dying. We grieve the end of relationships. We grieve the loss of a job sometimes, or anything that is a loss. We can go through a grief period. Well, death is a much more sort of final grief, but the ends of marriages bring grief. The ends of friendships, the end of a job, the end of, I remember feeling a little lost when I graduated from high school, and then again when I graduated from college, right? My life changed significantly, both of those times. And feeling some grief about that. And, in relationships that broke up, feeling grief after that, even when it was a mutual decision, and amicable, or it was my decision for my mental health to break up with somebody. There's still a grieving process, and that is natural. Everybody does it. Everybody who's not a sociopath, I would think, in some way. And so that grieving appears to be healthy. And it's an important part for us to come to grips with death and dying. So kind of to recap a little bit, to bring it back around, when you have an understanding that death is part of the natural cycle, we're born, we go through the life stages, and we die, our body dies, and it happens to everybody, and has happened to everybody throughout time. It happened to Jesus and Buddha, and yes, you can believe that Jesus was resurrected, and yes, you can believe that, Buddha's spirit went on to a different realm, but their bodies died at some point. So it doesn't matter how enlightened you are or what have you, and yes, there are belief systems that believe in physical immortality. I know there are, supposed Taoist practices that make people immortal, physically immortal. In alchemy, in Western alchemy, for example, people are looking for the Philosopher's Stone, which grants immortality. And the real secret to that is that it is a spiritual process. And yes, there are physical practices, but back, when people were practicing alchemy in the, in the Renaissance era and stuff like that, spiritual and physical experimentation were not separate things, right? So Isaac Newton, for example, believed that the mechanistic, clockwork way that the physical universe worked, inventor of Newtonian physics and inventor of calculus, and the way that, planets moved and all of this stuff, he believed that that was proof of God, proof of spiritual reality. And he had, Isaac Newton had copies of numerous spiritual texts, including the Emerald Tablet, which is, a famous Hermetic document outlining, spiritual laws. So, again, back then, these were not separate pursuits. And yes, people were doing things like trying to turn lead into gold, and, a lot of that stuff you can take two viewpoints of. Like, one is a lot of alchemical writing was just that. It was people who were doing spiritual, physical experimentation, and those things were not separate. They were looking for the essence of the material world, the spiritual aspects behind that. Another part of that is that there is pure spiritual alchemy, and that some of the physical stuff that they wrote about, like the essence of salt and this and that, and these processes of, solve and coagula and all of these things, these were allegorical and were meant to hide the spiritual work that they were doing, because it could have been repressed by religious figures, or they meant to hide it from people. A lot of spiritual doctrines were hidden, the word mystery comes from, these schools that were teaching hidden spiritual, mystery schools were schools that were teaching hidden spiritual realities and techniques and processes and things like that. And the mystery schools existed. There are mystery schools today, but not like there were, thousands of years ago. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example, in Greece lasted, was a place you could go and take psychoactive chemicals and commune with the gods, lasted for well over 1,000 years. And, tens of thousands, it was huge complex, and tens of thousands of people a year would go through whatever it is we went through. But we don't know a lot of it because it was a mystery. But we do know that they drank this beer. I think it was called Kaikon, and it was basically psychoactive beer. It had ergot in it, which is today what we know as LSD. Same kind of chemical. LSD comes from ergot, which is a parasitic fungus that lives on certain types of grain. And it is hallucinogenic, and people were probably using psychoactive stuff to basically do shamanic work, right? To basically do these journeys and visit the afterlife and, commune with the gods and goddesses. And people who have written about going through these processes talk about them as life-changing and entheogenic, right? Embodying the gods. So these, these processes, these alchemical processes are spiritual, and meant to develop the spirit in ways that, the afterlife might be a little bit different. You might have some control over how you reincarnate, or you might go on to a place, a plane, an existence where you are, more angelic, so to speak, although I think angels are actually different species of spirit, but, where you have more abilities to help out mankind. You have more knowledge, you have evolved more through spiritual knowledge. And I think, honestly, that's what most immortality practices that were genuine were about. Not about making the physical body immortal, although certainly, if you talk about Taoism from China, some of the practices were very health-inducing, right? So there are Qigong, which are the energy practices. You might be familiar with Tai Chi, and lots of other practices, energy work, that are meant to heal the body and meant to keep the body healthy. And that stuff works really well. I've seen, I used to live in Boston, and sometimes I would walk through the park in the morning, through the Common, which is a pretty big park in the middle of Boston. On my way to work, I worked in downtown Boston, and I would see people from the Chinatown community, older, like really old, like maybe 80s, 90-year-old people from the Chinatown community, Chinese elders, out in the park exercising. And these people were limber, energetic, flexible, healthy. I'd see, an 80 or 90-year-old man like doing pull-ups from a tree, or, using playground equipment, or older woman like pick up a stick and doing these acrobatic sword forms with it, that sort of thing. So these exercise practices, were meant to keep the body young and healthy, and they sure do. I mean, gosh, there's, that proof positive there, but there's plenty of research about Qigong and Tai Chi and meditation and all these things about the health-giving benefits. But do people physically live forever? And my answer to that is like my answer to a lot of things. I have not personally ever met somebody who has lived longer than, say, the oldest person I know is my grandmother, who just turned 105. And that's pretty darn old. And I cannot remember meeting somebody older than that. So are there people who have been alive for 200, 400 years? And are they people? Are they physical people? I have not experienced that. Is it a possibility or a probability? So in an infinite and expanding universe, anything is technically possible. Could there be physical human beings, people in bodies who have lived for hundreds of years? Maybe. I haven't experienced it, so I'm not going to believe it or disbelieve it at this point. It's what we call healthy skepticism, right? Until there is some at least secondhand knowledge, not just stories or myths or what have you. I'm not going to buy into that now, or not that I don't buy into it. I'm just going to reserve my judgment about whether I buy into that. There are lots of stories in different systems of belief about immortal beings, that are gods and goddesses or specially enlightened beings or what have you, taking physical form. And, my take is that your spirit is immortal, and these are, if people have encountered these beings, they're probably spiritual, and they may be powerful enough to affect physical reality. Because, I know for a fact that sometimes even just normal human spirits can appear physically. I have seen it. I have witnessed spirits. I have met many, many people. If you don't believe in ghosts, that's fine. You haven't experienced one in the way that I and many people have. I have had chilling experiences with spirits, and I know many, many people with a chilling experience with deceased human beings, witnessing firsthand, seeing with physical eyes. So sometimes that can happen. So if you have somebody who is really, really developed, again, they've developed this spiritual immortality, this level where they can affect physical reality from a purely spiritual plane, I believe that that's possible. And it's something I believe is possible. Have I witnessed that? Again, I've witnessed some paranormal stuff. I have witnessed some non-human spiritual entities that I have seen with my physical eyes that other people I was with saw with their physical eyes. And these could not be humans or projections or what have you of any kind. And we were not on drugs. Promise you that. But there were a lot of us who saw, I've been out in the desert and seen huge beings. Were they aliens? Were they gods? Were they spiritual creatures? I don't know. I think they were spiritual creatures. And I've participated in some Native American ceremonies where there have been spirits present that other people have seen physically as well. So these things are real to me, but I don't think human physical bodies are designed to live forever and can be coaxed with current technical or spiritual know-how into living forever. Very long time, yes. My grandmother's 105, and who knows how long she will keep going. Maybe she'll be 130, who knows. But people are living longer and longer. Technology is approaching places where we're unlocking a lot of things. Now, there are animals on Earth that live a very long time. There are sharks and turtles, for example, that are hundreds of years old. There are other types of animals that don't appear to have physical death built into their systems the way that humans do. The other part of immortality is, if humans could, say, easily become physically immortal, with the way that we reproduce and use up resources of this planet, we would very quickly have run into an ecological disaster that could have made this a very unpleasant place to live. Imagine being immortal in a place where you lived forever, but you were sick all the time because the air was so polluted, or there wasn't enough food, or the water was polluted, or there were massive wars over food and resources. Because we have seen that in the history of mankind, where there have been fights over resources and genocides have taken place, wars, all kinds of stuff. So, if it is possible for physical immortality, maybe it's not such a great idea. And again, a lot of the drive towards that is a fear of death. What I will say is that, dying too early, like because you live an unhealthy life or an accident happens, is a bit tragic because, you've got more to accomplish here, right? And so the healthier you can be, and the longer you can extend your life, as long as you are evolving spiritually and learning the lessons you're supposed to learn, it's probably a good thing. So this has been a very long and tangent-filled conversation, one-way conversation, talk about death, dying, immortality, the cycles of life. I hope this has been interesting to you. I don't want to run too long on this episode. I will tackle things like reincarnation and immortality in more depth in future podcasts. If there's something you would like for me to talk about from a shamanic perspective, or a guest you'd like me to try to talk to, I would like to have some more guests. Please reach out on my website. The details of that are in the closing of the outro of this episode. I love you all. I hope you're staying healthy and well, and I hope this has been useful and given you some things to think about.
You have been listening to Speaking Spirit with your host, John Moore. For more info or to contact John, go to mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.